Hi, everyone. I'm excited. With me today are Chris Coffey and Frank Wagner. They've been working with Marshall Goldsmith for over 30 years, and both of you have helped develop the stakeholder-centered coaching process in a way that's made it remarkably effective. Marshall considers both of you as one of the top two executive coaches in the entire world, and I'm excited to have you join me today. And I'm excited to have a Frank cup of coffee with Frank Wagner and Chris Coffey. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Andy. And it's a pleasure to do another Frank Coffee Talk with you.
It's always a pleasure. It's great to have the three of us together on the call.
Well, thanks again for joining us, guys. So what our coffee chat today is, and Marshall talks a lot about this, it's leaders that have unrecognized behaviors that hold them back. So they're high-value leaders. They're not as successful as they truly can be because they do things they're not aware of doing that just keeps them stuck. So I'd love to get your thoughts about this today. Kind of what do you see holding leaders back? And more importantly, what specifically can they do to recognize these behaviors and change them in a way so they can be even more successful?
I think this is a great topic, Andy. You know, Marshall in his wonderful book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, lists 20 unrecognizable habits, winning too much, adding too much value, passing judgment, making excuses, blaming others. I mean, there's 20 of them. And Marshall's very fond of quoting Peter Drucker. And Peter said, we teach leaders what to do. We very often don't teach them what not to do. And that's what really ties into these unrecognizable habits. And so often we're just totally unaware that we're doing them. Let me give you an example. And I think this is the one that Marshall actually says is the most prevalent one with individuals he works with. And it's the number one, winning too much. And very often, we have this incredible need to win at all costs, when it matters, when it doesn't matter, when it's totally beside the point, and even sometimes when it's detrimental to win. And a good skill for coaches is to be able to recognize these habits. When you say something and they always seem to have to one-up you, how can you point that out to somebody in a way to say, the last 3 times I mentioned something, you felt an incredible need to one-up me. Are you aware of that? That's part of our job as good coaches, to be able to, another one is, making excuses. I can point out to somebody, you've made 3 excuses in the last 5 minutes as to why this didn't get done. And the quality of your excuses are really exquisite, and they'll smile and laugh and say, well, was that a compliment? I say, well, take it any way you want. But then I like to also ask, what part of this problem do you own? Which really throws them off of the treadmill of needing to win all the time or blaming others. So a good skill for coaches is to be able to observe those behaviors and help individuals recognize, acknowledge them, and then also see how that's not pulling people towards you, it tends to push them away.
Chris, thank you for your thoughts on that. Fascinating stuff. Frank, I'm really curious what your thoughts are on this and wondering if you could share with us.
I actually have experienced a lot more, and that is adding too much value. So, they're in conversation and someone is coming up with a plan of action of what they're going to do about something. And the plan is far from perfect, yet it's a workable plan. And the helpful leader wants to contribute to make sure that person is successful. So they start adding value to this person's thinking. And what they're not realizing in the eyes of the other person is the person is not saying, you're not adding useful thoughts to me, but I'm feeling like you maybe don't necessarily agree with all of that I'm doing or my commitment to this plan now that you've got your fingerprints on it. It's not as high. So this thing is unconscious in people, and it's unconscious because of exactly what Chris said when talking about winning too much is very few people are going to go to someone and saying, you're trying to one-up me. And again, if you really like this leader, I'm talking about people that you really like, they've got all kinds of positive characteristics as a leader, and you don't want to say to them, you're adding too much value to me. So when you talk about what do you do about it, it's only going to change if people are willing to call people on it.
Building off of what Frank said, I mean, you can look at the two that we just mentioned, winning too much and adding too much value, which are two of Marshall's unrecognizable habits. They build off of each other. I mean, these are all interchangeable. And so when somebody, like Frank said, you can get somebody to ask themselves the question, is what I'm about to say necessary? And really answer, do I need to say this? Because so often people feel compelled to continue to, and let me give you a specific example of how it can happen. I could be listening to Frank and I say, Frank, that's a really great idea. But what if you just did this way? What we've done with that overuse of the but is to say to somebody, we think politely, you're wrong and I'm right. I'm going to tell you the answer now. What you just said is fine, but here's the real answer. And so good coaches pick up these behavioral colloquialisms that people use. Now, the person on the other end, when you use that word, that's great, but you've just dismissed or diminished their idea. Now, if that person works for you, what's the likelihood of them continuing to come in and try to think out of the box if every time they do it, they know they're going to hear, well, that's great, but what if we just did it this way?
So thanks so much for sharing your thoughts and perspective on this. Here's just something I'm just curious about. When you're working with a leader and you identify these unrecognizable behaviors that they do, that they don't know they're doing, how do they respond when you pick them all out? Well, you just did that, and you just did that, and you just did that. What's sort of a common reaction to this, just out of curiosity?
Well, I'll comment on that with a specific example. First of all, we've been hired to be coaches. So part of the job is to help people pick up on these things. Now, certainly you have to do it with a little humor and, I often use self-deprecating humor. I mean, I say, look, I've learned how to, I used to think interrupting people was a great skill because we could shorten the conversation and I'm going to add value here. And if you're really smart, you'll listen to me. Well, that was just my self-perception and it was wrong. I'll give you an example. Sitting at lunch one day with somebody that was starting to work with, the fourth time he said, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I stopped him and I said, do you realize in the last 6 or 7 minutes you've used the phrase, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you? And he said, no, I really wasn't aware of that. I said, is that a phrase you use a lot? And he said, I think so. And I said, well, if you don't put that caveat on the front end of it, should I assume maybe you're not being honest? And he smiled. And I said, it's a fine phrase. Overused, people get tired of hearing it. I'm going to be perfectly candid with you. There's lots of those little colloquialisms that we pick up that we're unaware of that don't add value to conversations.
I think there's a variety of reactions. Sometimes, just like Chris mentioned, it's just surprise. It's like I said, it's unconscious. They have no clue that they're doing this thing. The other one, which I honestly think is there, is embarrassment. It embarrasses them. Now, here's a question, though, are you embarrassing this person because you want to embarrass them, or are you embarrassing them because you want to help them and do something of value for them? And as long as they see it as the latter, this is a gift. So these are all natural reactions to pointing these kinds of behaviors out to them, yet it's a necessary step if they're ever going to change.
Thanks so much for your comments on that. And I want to thank both of you for joining me today for another Frank Cup of Coffee with Frank Wagner and Chris Coffey. It's been a pure delight. I'm looking forward to doing more of these in the future. And I hope both of you guys just have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Andy. And I'm looking forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure.